Fog wrapped the valley in a clammy embrace, so thick that lost travelers would swear it possessed a mind of its own. Whispering winds echoed through the craggy hills, carrying fragments of sorrow and regret. At the center of the valley, an ancient clock tower, its mechanisms frozen, its gears rusted, rose like a lonely sentinel, doomed to linger at the same dreadful hour. The hands were locked at midnight, a time that once brought about an unspeakable. Long ago, the tower was the pride of the region, a masterwork of iron and stone that chimed with a bright clarity. Now, it stood silent, its broken face staring like a watchful, unblinking eye. Stories told of how each night, when darkness settled, the same gruesome event replayed. No one knew if it was the spirits of the dead crying out for justice or the tower itself, weaving illusions of the past. But one thing was certain. Come midnight, the massacre always reawakened. I arrived, foolishly disregarding all warnings. Curious travelers before me had whispered rumors in nearby towns about this forsaken place, describing phantom lights, blood-curdling screams in the still of night, and hollow footprints that trailed across the abandoned thoroughfare. It sounded, at first, like little more than a local legend to keep children indoors and scare away trespassers, yet the deeper I dug, the more horrifying details I uncovered. Colorful accounts turned to hushed confessions, and each person who recounted the story seemed shaken by the memory. Determined to unravel the truth, I put aside reason and traveled into that uncanny realm, half hoping I might find a clumsy old hoax behind the sinister lore. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, where the last weeds of the outskirts gave way to the valley's gloom, I knew something was dreadfully wrong. During my first evening there, I found lodgings in a rundown house once owned by the caretaker of the tower. The house was an odd structure, constructed of warped timbers, so battered by time and storms that it leaned precariously toward the main road. Thick dust settled on every surface, and the stale air hinted at neglect and sorrow. An uneasy stillness blanketed the valley, with no lights visible except the faint glow of moonlight reflecting on stagnant puddles. From my cracked window I gazed up at the looming clock tower. Midnight was approaching. Despite telling myself the stories were superstition, a tense anticipation churned in my stomach as the clock's hands approached that cursed hour, though, in truth, they never moved. And as the clock stood frozen, the last flicker of hope that it might simply be broken rather than haunted vanished in the hush of the night. I heard it first as a scraping sound, like metal dragging over stone. My pulse quickened. I pressed my ear to the window glass, struggling to discern whether I was imagining it. Moments later, guttural cries pierced the silence, followed by a thunderous crash from within the clock tower. It resounded as if the valves of hell had unlocked, unleashing centuries of anguish. I rushed from the house, compelled by a strangely urgent dread. The tower's ancient doors creaked open before me, though I saw no hand turning the latch. I stepped inside, my lantern casting trembling light along the dusty floor. In an instant, the gloom melted into a vision of the past. The interior was no longer old and rotted, but pristine, with polished gears and glimmering walls. People in old-fashioned attire hurried through corridors, some smiling, others wearing uneasy frowns. Further inside, a group of armed men gathered, their faces concealed by ominous shadows. My lantern flickered, revealing a moment in time that refused to die. I felt trapped by this spectral memory, compelled to witness the ancient clock's final chiming. A wave of dread settled in my chest as I saw a young family, a mother, father, and small child, caught in the middle of the armed men. A dispute raged, though I couldn't make out all their words. The leader of the armed men raised a rifle, and the child screamed. The clock was about to strike midnight. Something told me to avert my eyes, but I couldn't. My body froze. The echoes of the child's wail bounced off the cold stone walls. Just as the clock's bell would have rung, the rifle erupted in a deafening shot. Blood spattered the gears, painting them with the crimson sheen. More gunshots followed. I wanted to intervene, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. The horror played out before me like a macabre theater, repeating each shot, each scream, as though it had all been rehearsed 1,000 times over. Suddenly, the vision ended. The pristine hall vanished, leaving me alone in the derelict interior, with my lantern's feeble light. The stone walls were once more cracked, the floor littered with debris, and every step echoed in a mocking hush. Only the faint smell of blood remained, lingering even though centuries had passed. Shaken, I darted out of the tower, stumbling back to the caretaker's house. My mind refused to make sense of what I had just seen. The experience felt more tangible than a mere hallucination. I collapsed into a chair, my head swimming with terror. Whatever had befallen this valley had left a scar so profound that time itself seemed to have surrendered. Midnight was the fulcrum of tragedy, the dreadful pivot around which this torment revolved, and each night the watchers of the valley had to endure it anew. Over the next days, I explored the deserted settlements scattered around the clock tower. I found shell-like buildings, their windows shattered, and furniture still arranged as though the occupants had only stepped out for a moment. But the people, if any still lived, kept themselves hidden. Occasionally I would catch a fleeting silhouette at the edge of my vision, or a shift in the fog that hinted at a figure darting behind a wall, yet no one dared to approach me. Carved graffiti, old and weathered, appeared along the door frames. Warnings to stay away from the tower. Pleas for help. Cryptic phrases suggesting curses upon the land. The more I roamed these empty streets, the more I felt a sentient presence observing me. It was impossible to shake the feeling of being watched. In one home, I discovered a small diary hidden beneath the rotted floorboards. The pages were brittle and the ink was faded, but I managed to decipher the final entries. The writer, a man named Samuel, recounted the days leading up to the tower's last chime. He spoke of a local lord who had built the tower as a monument to his power. Underneath this veneer of grandeur, however, lay corrupt dealing. The lord extracted heavy taxes and silenced every protest with brutal force, employing a private militia that answered only to him. Whispers of rebellion grew in the valley, and a secret group began plotting to overthrow him. Yet, on the day they planned to act, the lord discovered their conspiracy. He arranged one grand event, luring dissenters to the tower under the pretense of forging peace. At midnight, his men struck, leaving no survivor. Blood soaked the iron gears and the clock's hands stopped, never to move again. Samuel's closing sentences read, "The souls of the fallen cry out, trapped in this haunted moment, reliving our final screams till some righteous hand undoes the curse." Shaken by this knowledge, I realized I was not merely a bystander, but perhaps a link to the tower's hidden truth. The drudgery of the caretaker's house weighed on me each evening as I awaited the next midnight. I knew the visions would return. A part of me wished to flee, escaping the ghosts that bound this valley in their claws. But a stronger part of me demanded I see this through, seeking some remedy or redemption for the trapped spirits. Piecing together the bitter fragments felt like my duty, and so, night after night, I ventured again into that spectral domain, no longer a passive witness, but an investigator searching for answers. The illusions became clearer, more precise, as though coaxing me deeper into the epicenter of the tower's secrets. On the third night of my stay, the caretaker's house itself manifested a spectacle. Just before midnight, I woke to the sound of faint footsteps across the floorboards above me. Trembling, I lit the lantern and climbed the creaking stairs. Everything was pitch black, but an unearthly aura glowed at the end of the hallway. Stepping closer, I saw the ghostly figure of an elderly man. He wore a caretaker's uniform, and his form shimmered like a reflection on dark water. In his hands, he clutched a set of keys. Sensing my presence, he turned, meeting my gaze with spectral eyes brimming with regret. Too late, he whispered. I was fickle. I knew the plan. I should have warned them." My breath caught. Could this be the spirit of the caretaker who had once lived here? He reached out a trembling finger and gestured for me to follow. His figure passed through a wall, beckoning me onward. I remained rooted for a moment, my heart hammering. Then, unbidden courage compelled me forward. Pressing my hand against the wall, I felt it yield. Cold air enveloped me, as though pulling me into another era. I found myself transported into a corridor within the tower, at least that was how it appeared. This corridor was pure illusion, for it lay exactly where the caretaker's walls should have been. But the caretaker's ghost was there, moving purposefully. At the end of the corridor, he pushed open a door, revealing a hidden workshop. The air smelled of wood shavings, hot metal, and human fear. Here, the Lord's men were assembling something monstrous in the corner. Thick rods and gears, resembling pieces of the tower's timekeeping mechanism, were being modified with jagged edges that looked like they could mangle flesh. I saw the caretaker in living form, hunched over a desk, forging tools as if in a daze. He was an unwilling accomplice, his eyes reflecting torment. The caretaker's spectral form, now at my side, exhaled a defeated sigh. I was under threat. My family. They promised to spare them if I helped, but they killed everyone anyway. Then he floated back into the corridor, dissolving into the swirling shadows. When the vision faded, I stood once more in the caretaker's upper floor, no hidden passage in sight. My breath caught in ragged bursts, the terror nearly overwhelming me. Still, a glimmer of clarity emerged. The caretaker himself had provided the keys, literally and figuratively, to understanding the tower's dark mechanisms. Its clockwork had been altered to serve an unspeakable brutality. Maybe the caretaker had hidden something that could undo this eternal loop. I rummaged through old chests and drawers, caked with dust and mildew, praying to find an actual ring of keys or a clue that would break the cycle. At last, tucked under a loose floorboard, I found a heavy iron key attached to a small blueprint. The drawing showed a secret chamber beneath the tower, its outline faint, as if erased many times. No text explained its purpose, but somehow I knew this secret chamber was where the tragedy's final knot lay tangled. Late the next afternoon, with the blueprint pressed close to my chest, I ventured to the tower. Fog coiled around the building, obscuring even the topmost spire. The door, which had opened so mysteriously before, now seemed jammed. I heaved against the rusted iron until it gave way. My lantern lit only a few steps ahead, and I navigated by the caretaker's blueprint. It led me down a spiraling stairwell into a crypt-like basement. Stony steps descended into murk. At the bottom, I discovered a massive iron gate, locked tight. Swallowing my fear, I tried the heavy key. It fit perfectly, and the gate groaned open, revealing a chamber I never would have guessed existed. It was a dungeon of sorts, lined with broken shackles and dried pools of what could only be centuries-old blood. Almost immediately, the illusions returned in a flood. I saw men and women in chains, some weeping, others praying. Footsteps of soldiers echoed, culminating in cacophonous screams that dissolved into a hush. The caretaker appeared before me, or at least his phantom did, repeating the words, "Undo what was done. Free them." I wanted to speak, but my throat felt paralyzed. The blueprint glinted in my lantern light. On one corner I noticed a peculiar sigil etched in black ink. It resembled a shattered clock face, with a single swirl crossing the center. Suddenly, the caretaker's ghost pressed a trembling finger to the emblem, as though urging me to enact some ancient ritual. Then the voice returned in my head. "At midnight, the breach can be opened. Destroy the gear that binds the hour." Before I could question him, he vanished. I climbed up from the dungeon, racing against the inevitable approach of midnight. The caretaker's message ricocheted in my mind, hinting that the key lay in the main mechanism near the top of the tower. Once there, I found a large iron gear partially embedded in the clock's workings. All the other gears had corroded with time, but this one seemed eerily intact, as though protected by the curse. Perhaps this was the gear that binds the hour. I pulled at it, hammered on it with a piece of scrap metal. It wouldn't budge. Sweat beaded on my brow despite the chill in the tower. And then midnight arrived. A ghostly chime rang out, impossible yet all too real in the hush. I knew the massacre would replay, and indeed, I glimpsed movement below. Spirits of the Lord's guards advanced, weapons in hand. I had moments before the illusions, so strong as to mimic substance, would seize me. With desperation, I hurled a broken chunk of metal against the gear. The clang reverberated, stirring the swirling shadows around me. I struck again and again, each blow fracturing my eardrums with harsh echoes. Blood pounded in my skull. Time slipped into madness. The guardians from the vision neared. Their gazes filled with grim purpose. I shouted in defiance, refusing to surrender to this eternal nightmare. Finally, an ear-splitting crack split the air. The gear twisted and separated from its axis, breaking off in a spray of fragments. Instantly, a deafening roar erupted in the tower, as though the entire structure exhaled centuries of pent-up agony. The illusions flickered, and I saw the caretaker's spirit lifting his face skyward. One by one, the ghostly figures of those slaughtered began to fade, their expressions a mixture of relief and sorrow. I stumbled back, dropping to my knees with exhaustion and overwhelming dread. The tower moaned ominously, its cracked walls threatening to collapse. Stone dust rained down from overhead, and I scrambled to find an exit. I half jumped, half fell down the spiral steps as the structure groaned above me. Each moan a reminder of its impending ruin. The phantoms wavered, flickering in and out, no longer bound to the endless midnight replay. Their tortured wails gradually softened until only the enormous hush of an ancient building's final throes remained. When I burst through the tower doors, a gust of cold air greeted me. I sprinted across the courtyard as thunderous crashes behind me signaled the tower's final collapse. With one last wrenching groan, the tower fell, kicking up a storm of dust and rubble. In the ensuing calm, I stood gasping in the moonlight. The valley's fog lifted as if whisked away by unseen hands, revealing a landscape that felt somehow less burdened. Stars pierced the night sky, shining brilliantly. It was the first time since my arrival that I saw them unobscured. My heart hammered in my chest, and my muscles quivered in exhaustion. But a slow, piercing realization took hold. The clock was gone. The gear that bound the dreadful moment had been destroyed, and with it the souls trapped in that cursed hour were freed. Yet an unshakable gloom still drifted in the air, a lingering sorrow for the lives lost. Redemption was never a cure-all. The memory of bloodshed would remain, etched into the valley's foundation. I spent the night under the stars, reluctant to return to the caretaker's house or any other structure haunted by the echoes of the past. As dawn brightened, I ventured to see what remained of the tower. The once colossal edifice was now a slab of broken stone, entangled with twisted iron. Vines and moss would overtake it in the seasons to come. Perhaps in time, the valley would see new settlers. Perhaps the pain from its history would fade into legend. Standing amid the rubble, I offered a silent prayer for the souls forced to relive their final moments over and over. Metal relics from the tower's interior gears gleamed in the early light, ephemeral reminders of cruelty and bondage. One particularly sharp shard caught my eye. I picked it up gingerly. It felt cold, yet it radiated a strange warmth that I couldn't quite pinpoint. A final vestige of the lost caretaker's involvement, or maybe the last sigh of the tower itself. I lingered a bit longer, half expecting some new horror to befall me, puzzled. But only a gentle breeze toyed with the edges of my coat. No whispers of ghosts, no illusions of murder. It was all over. The caretaker's blueprint remained tucked away in my satchel, a relic I had no intention of destroying. I sensed that it might be the only surviving record offering clarity about what once happened here. In the months to come, I hoped to locate any living descendants of this valley's residents, to enlighten them that the cycle had ceased. Whether that truth would bring relief or dredge up sorrow, I didn't know. But knowledge was a small measure of respect I could grant those who had perished. As I left the valley, the path seemed different somehow. Wider, bathed in brighter light, free from the oppressive gloom that had greeted me. The hush remained, but it felt tranquil rather than morbid. My thoughts turned to how events in some corners of the world remain locked in time, awaiting a release that may never come unless someone intervenes. This was the lesson the tower had taught me. Sometimes the only way to break free of torment is to confront it directly, no matter how terrifying. In doing so, we can restore balance and peace. Even in the wake of tragedy, redemption can sprout like a hardy weed in a desolate land, given a single seed of resolve. Days later, looking back on my journey, I found no easy words to describe it. The valley, even without its clock tower, retained a haunting magnetism, the kind that unsettles one's dreams with half-forgotten screams and shadows flitting at the edges of sight. Yet it also possessed a quiet dignity, born from centuries of suffering. I hoped the caretaker's soul and those of the innocent they tried to save had at last found rest. Never again would midnight signal a gruesome reenactment of violence. Time in that valley had begun to flow forward once more, and in my heart I carried a deeper appreciation for the fragile threads that hold our lives in place, each moment brimming with a potency that can shape histories and curses, and sometimes break them. If you ever find yourself near that valley, look at the wide clearing where a tower once stood. Feel the wind. You might sense a hush of memory, a lingering brush of sorrow. But you'll also find, in the emptiness, the promise of a new dawn.